All right, so the study on Leviticus, it's really a study on Leviticus 16, on the Day of Atonement, but there is so much that we have to understand about the Day of Atonement that the first 15 chapters prepare us for. So the first 15 chapters in Leviticus are somewhat topical, but they're there to prepare us for what is happening in Leviticus 16. So today I want to start talking about the sacrifices. As I mentioned, next Sunday we'll be in Morris, so we won't be here for Sunday school, but we'll pick up with the sacrifices, Lord willing, the week after. And today my goal is to actually cover the first 3 chapters of Leviticus and the first 3 sacrifices, and I think we could do that. The next set of sacrifices, chapters 4 through 6, is all about one kind of sacrifice, and that's the sin offering. And there is, since it's 3 chapters, you can imagine, there's a lot to talk about sin offerings. And when we talk about sin offerings, we also have to talk about sin, and we also have to talk about atonement, and we have to talk about forgiveness of sin. And so we'll probably spend a couple weeks on the sin offerings as we get to those. Okay, so the book of Leviticus, just by way of review from last week, is partly answering a question. The Old Testament law in general is answering this question, but the book of Leviticus in particular. How can a holy God live with a sinful people? So on Mount Sinai, God made a covenant with Israel. And he's a holy God, and he's a righteous God. But he wants to dwell and have fellowship in the midst of the people of Israel, his chosen people. But they're sinful, and they're fallen. And so how can he do that? Now, of course, from the New Testament perspective, from our perspective, we have the same problem. How can we have fellowship with a holy God? The solution to that is found in Christ Jesus. We're going to see one of the great passages of 2 Corinthians 5, and we read from this morning one of the scripture readings, I think it was from Romans 5, Romans 5, verses 10 and 11, that word reconciliation. So if you notice that this morning in the scripture reading, from Romans 5, verses 10 and 11, that's going to come up in 2 Corinthians 5 is the main passage on reconciliation in the New Testament. How do you reconcile us? How can a holy God live with a sinful people? How can we be reconciled with God? So that's the big question that we're after. Okay, so the sacrifices, Leviticus 1 through 5, which is actually closer to 1 through 7, also dealing with the sin in the Old Testament, and then the priests are kind of Leviticus 6, but they're kind of Leviticus 8. There's some overlap there. The uncleanness chapters, and then we'll get to the Day of Atonement. So, all right. Some interpretation about the sacrifices. So Old Testament law is what's called case law, where they give out a case or a situation. If this is the situation you encounter, this is how you handle it. And the laws, when you come across them in the Old Testament, they'll have kind of a title, but it's not like a big title. It's kind of a title. I call it the title, but it's not like a title in English. Then there's sometimes an introduction. Then they'll give you various cases. I say just case 1, case 2. There could be 5, 6, 7 cases. Some of these get, the sin offerings get very detailed. The ones we look at today might have 3 cases to them. Then there might be some exceptions or additions. We'll look at one of those today in the grain offering, I think it is. And then there's a conclusion, often. Now, not everyone has all of these pieces to it, but they often have these pieces to them, so you can kind of see them as we go through. And I'll point them out as we go through these 3 chapters today, where each of these pieces are. So that's kind of how it works. Now, another thing we have to keep in mind is the tabernacle is referenced in these verses. So we're going to come back to this diagram. I didn't create this diagram. I stole it from somebody, but plagiarized, I think is the right word. But it was simple. There are some very detailed descriptions of the tabernacle, but they're so detailed that you get lost in the forest. You get lost in the trees for the forest. So on the far right side, you see the word gate is written vertically there, before the brazen altar. And then there is a little outer court, and then a laver, think bird bath, okay, where you wash your hands. That's a laver. And then the rectangle, that's the holy place. And where the Ark of the Covenant is, that's the most holy place, or Holy of Holies. Inside the holy place, there's a table with bread on it. There's a menorah, which is the golden candlestick, and another altar, an altar of incense, where incense is burned all the time. That altar of incense comes into play when we get to the priests, as we'll find out. So a lot of these offerings, we'll see this, it says that the person bringing the offering brings it to the gate. Okay, so that's the gate. Slaughters the animal, and then the priests will come, and the Levites will come and manage the animal. But this is the brazen altar is right inside the gate. So your average person who's not a priest doesn't get very far into the tabernacle. They come into the gate, they slaughter the animal, and then the priest takes it away, and then the person will sometimes go away or stand around and wait, as we'll see, while it's being sacrificed, grilled. Think of, if you like to grill meat. This would have been like grilling steaks all day long. And then they have a place where they can wash up. The laver is where the priests wash their hands before they do anything else. So we want to keep that in mind, and I'll refer to this from time to time as we get into parts of the sacrifice that reference the tabernacle. Okay, so the first one is burnt offerings. This is from Leviticus 1. Now, I think the King James calls these whole burnt offerings, W-H-O-L-E, and I think the reason for that is the entire animal is consumed. No part of it is saved. No part of it's eaten, I should say. No part is eaten. Yeah, did I say not eaten? Did I use a dope? Yeah, no part of it is eaten, consumed. Yeah. Of the burnt offering. So sometimes it's referred to as a whole burnt offering. And the way to remember that is the Hebrew word is cholam, and then you know that it's whole burnt offering, cholam. See? Easy. Okay. So in chapter 1, Leviticus 1, starts right away. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock." Okay, so this offering, verse 3, if his offering is a burnt offering. So this is the kind of the title of this section in Leviticus is the burnt offering. If his sacrifice is a burnt offering. And then there's the title of the book of Leviticus could almost be called, if any one of you brings an offering to the Lord. And that word for offering there is more generic. And so that's why we're going to talk about sacrifices here for the next few chapters. So the highest level here, we're talking about offering. And then verse 3, we're talking about burnt offering. And then case 1 is also in verse 3. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd. Okay, so it's cattle. then here are the rules. Now in verse 10, you see the next one. If his gift for a burnt offering is from the flock, sheep or a goat. Okay, so there's the rules for a sheep or a goat. And then verse 14, if his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, then he shall offer turtle doves or pigeons. And so then you could offer a bird. The bird was used if someone was poor and had no cattle or sheep, then they would bring a bird. And we'll actually see this later. So today happens to be, I'm going to interrupt myself for a second because I just brought up turtle doves. See if you make the connection. So today in the church calendar is called Candlemas. Today is the day that the church historically celebrated the bringing of the offering that Mary had to bring after giving birth to a son. We'll see this in Leviticus 12. After a woman gave birth to a son, she had to bring an offering to the temple, and this is the day that it's normally celebrated, approximately 6 weeks after the birth of Jesus. And it's recorded in Leviticus 1, I think, when they go, or not Leviticus, Luke, sorry, Luke chapter 1, when Mary and Jesus go. And so they go, and she brings a turtle dove. Well, why would Mary bring a turtle dove? It's because they were poor. They didn't have a lot of money, and they didn't, Joseph he didn't have cattle or a flock that he tended. He was probably a stonemason. We call him a carpenter. He was probably a stonemason. So they didn't have a lot of money, and they didn't have animals. So she brought a bird. Okay, love to go down that rabbit trail, but we'll keep going. All right, so the burnt offering, for each of these, you'll notice that the burnt offering is a male. And they always say without blemish, of course. So when you looked at the animal, it couldn't have obvious spots, couldn't be sick, couldn't have obvious ailments. There couldn't be anything obviously wrong with the animal when you brought it, visually looking at them. But the burnt offerings always had to be a male. And then it says in the first one here in verse 3, it says a male, he brings it to the entrance of the tent of meeting that he may be accepted before the Lord. So just to go back to here, he brings it to the gate, basically, the front of the tent of meeting. So he's bringing it outside the tabernacle. And the priest is going to check it to make sure it meets the qualifications. Did you bring a male without blemish? So the priest checks that. And then in verse 4 it says, he shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering. Who is the he? The he is the person bringing the offering, not the priest. Okay, so I bring the animal. I've got my goat. Except for the case of the bird, but bird comes later. We're just talking about cattle at this point. So I'm bringing a bull, or it'd have to be a bull. It couldn't be a steer. That's regulated somewhere else. So I'm bringing a bull to the front for my burnt offering. The priest checks it over, says it looks good. I put my hand on the head of the bull, and then the bull is put down. So the throat is slit. So in the sacrificial system, the blood always has to be drained out. Okay. So I, the one who bringing the offering, I'm the one who puts my hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it is accepted for me to make atonement. Now, we're going to talk about atonement a little bit later, because when we get to the sin offerings, we're going to have to talk more about atonement. The word for atonement often has been given the idea of covering over. So I'll just say a couple words briefly here about it. So you might see it like in a study Bible or in a Bible study. The idea of atonement in the Old Testament is to cover over. And there's a reason for that interpretation. One of the other major interpretations you might see is that the idea of atonement is to cleanse or to purge away. So imagine that something is, stained, or you spill something on the floor in the kitchen or on the carpet, and you come and you take the stain away, okay? That's the idea of atonement, removing the stain. There is another view, though, that's actually presented later in Leviticus that has the idea of making a payment. You're paying for something, and you've paid it off in full. And you can imagine, for example, like a fine, or imagine a traffic ticket. Not that anyone in here has ever gotten a traffic ticket, but imagine what it might be like to get pulled over by the state patrol and be given a ticket. Okay, so then, and then you go pay it. All right, you're paying it off, and the fact that it's paid off is atonement. And so we'll talk about that in more detail later as to what that probably means. I favor the third interpretation of paying.
That's what happens when Joy got stopped, they let her go on a warning. That's usually the tone for that.
Yeah, so someone already paid the ticket for her, so she didn't have to pay.
Maybe like 50 years ago.
So,
Sorry.
yeah, okay, so back to Leviticus, chapter, atonement. So whenever there's a whole burnt offering, whenever there's a burnt offering, and sometimes burnt offerings accompany other offerings, sometimes they're not just standalone, but we'll see them on the Day of Atonement as well. The burnt offering, the purpose of it is for atonement for the person who brings it. Then he shall kill the bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons and the priest shall bring the blood and throw the blood against the sides of the altar that is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So if we go back here, so they throw it on the sides of the altar for the brazen altar. Brazen means bronze, just in case you didn't know that. The bronze altar. They throw the blood against the sides of the altar that is at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then they shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces, and the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar, arrange the wood on the fire, and the Aaron's sons, the priest, shall arrange the pieces, the head, the fat on the wood that is on the fire on the altar, but its entrails and its legs, so they're field dressing it, if I can use that analogy for our deer hunters. They're field dressing this animal. But the entrails and its legs, they wash with water. And the priest shall burn all of it on the altar. So they wash that out and put it back on the altar as a burnt offering, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Now the food offering, and in the King James this was called a meat offering. It's not the best translation. And even my ESV has a footnote that says an offering by fire. And that's really a better translation. If you try to figure out what a food offering is, you won't come up with a good answer. So it's a burnt offering, which means it's being offered on fire. And the concluding statement here, the summary statement is, it's an offering made by fire, which gives off a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So this act in which we're doing is something that is acceptable to God. They were doing, we don't do this. They were doing was acceptable to God. So these are the various points of the offering. The burnt offering has to be a male. We're going to see a difference here in a minute on one of the other ones with that. It makes atonement, and you'll notice, and I wish we'll spend more time on this, I think, in Leviticus 16. But I'll point it out here for now that when the person bringing the offering puts his hand on the animal, it's at that point atonement is made. Okay? In other words, at that point in time, the reason for me to bring the offering, let's say I've sinned, it's not great, example. Let's say I've sinned, and I'm bringing this animal, and my hand is on that. My guilt, as it were, is being transferred from me to the animal. Okay, that when it's talking about the atonement is made at that point in time, it means that whatever reason I'm bringing this animal for an offering, that's being transferred to the animal. So I'm not dying, the animal is dying in my place. And then the animal dies. And the animal always dies by the shedding of blood, which we know from Hebrews, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Okay, so the food offering I've got there on the slide is the offering by fire. All right, so that's the burnt offering. The birds are done a little bit differently because you wring the head off instead of slitting its throat. Doesn't do much. And then they take care of that. There's no real conclusion to this set of laws on the burnt offering. It just kind of ends with the birds. So, any questions on the burnt offering? We're setting the stage for the Day of Atonement.
You always wonder about how many numbers of animals were being brought, how many people, and that brazen altar was big, kind of big.
Yes, it was very large. The brazen altar was very large. And you have to keep in mind that once we see, this is just giving the rules for whenever this happens, this is how you do it. How often you do it varies depending on the laws that you look at. So each person had to do this 3 times a year, or each head of household at least had to go 3 times a year, would have to bring a burnt offering. But then there's the Day of Atonement offerings. There's other offerings that you could bring if you wanted to. So there were feast times, or times where this would be going like crazy. But then there are times where it might not be so much. And during the week, it was voluntary whether someone brought offerings in during the week, that type of thing. So the schedule is different. But yeah, you can imagine that this is a fire that probably didn't go out very often.
So what was there a common day of the week to do this?
No, actually there is no common day of the week to do sacrifices. A lot of people think of the Sabbath as that day, but it wasn't.
Was the bull preference over the sheep or goat?
Well, it wasn't actually, it's a good question, so I'll repeat it. Was the bull preferred over a sheep or goat or bird? It's actually not given any preference. It was a matter of what you could afford. So if you could afford, if you had cattle and you had a little bit more of larger animals, then you would bring a bull. If you had smaller animals like sheep or goat, you would just bring one of those. And if you were poor or didn't keep cattle, you could bring a bird. So it was really based on what you had is what you offered. And the one exception is there's almost always an exception for those who are poor. We'll see as we go through these that the poor are given other options by which to bring sacrifices. And the one, not in this case, but in the sin offering, it's the turtle dove.
Is there an instance where these items were being sold, where people didn't have them, but they'd buy them?
Right, so there was, by the time we get to Jesus' day, you have people who are literally in the stock market, and they're buying and selling these animals so that when people show up to the temple, they could say, oh, here, we've got an animal for you. You need to buy ours to sacrifice if you didn't have your own. And then they were making money that way, which is unfortunate.
Now, it's really, the turtle dove had to be a male turtle dove too.
Yes.
It's really hard to tell.
Yes. But it's possible. If you know your animal husbandry,
Okay.
you can tell. There are people who get paid to tell the difference. Moving on to grain offerings. This is more your style here, I think, Joanne,
Okay.
right? So the grain offering, the beginning, gives us the rules. So the title of this one, chapter 2, verse 1, when anyone brings a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be. And so now the title is the grain offering, and then here are the general rules, or the introduction to it. It has to be of fine flour, has to have oil, and it has to have frankincense. Now, flour and oil makes sense, okay? That's what we use today. There's no change there. The frankincense is a white resin that was very fragrant. So it's not a spice that you would normally consume, but it's a fragrance that goes along with it. And as I was studying this, I was trying to figure out how would you make bread with frankincense? Because again, frankincense isn't for oral consumption. You can buy it today in those things that make your house smell nice, whatever they're called. Potpourris, or oil, not incense, but the oils, essential oils. Yeah, defibrillators? No, diffusers. Yeah. Well, he's dead, but he smells nice. Diffusers. Yeah. So it appears that you're making the bread, but the frankincense is burned not in the bread, but alongside the bread as odor, as not odor, but perfume. So you see that this is how we do it in chapter 2. You shall pour oil on it, take the flour, pour oil on it, put frankincense, it says on it, could be with it, and bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests. So you're bringing like a little basket with your unmade bread. Okay. And bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests. He shall take from it a handful of the fine flour and oil, and all of the frankincense, and burn this as its memorial portion on the altar. A food offering with a pleasing aroma. And again, food offering there is it's cooked with fire. With a pleasing aroma to the Lord. But the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. So you bring the basket with the ingredients. He burns some of it on the altar, and then Aaron and the priests, they get to eat the rest. So they get to take the rest, cook it, and eat it. Yeah, their cholesterol, I don't. But then we get into, there's different ways you can cook it. Oh, the memorial. So this comes up as a memorial. I was actually thinking about this today when we were having communion. Do this in remembrance of me. And the idea of memorials and remembrance in the Old Testament is never one of, oh, I forgot. Okay, that's, when you see memorial or you see remembrance, God remembered Noah. Did God forget while he was flooding the earth? Oh, I forgot about Noah. I better go see what he's up to. No, it's not a matter of forgetting. But it's usually a matter of, when God's remembering someone, God is acting on their behalf. God remembered the people of Israel and the covenant that he made with them, beginning of beginning of the book of Exodus. So when we remember, though, we have a memorial, which also includes bread, right? The Passover bread. Jesus is our Passover. He's our unleavened bread. And we do this in remembrance of him, not because we forgot him, but we are considering, we're contemplating, we're thinking about the significance of our Savior's death. And so this memorial portion, this idea of memorial, is similar. It's something that's being done to remind us of something else, which in this chapter doesn't tell us what that is. That'll come out in other places. And then the priest gets a portion. And then here's all the rules. If you bake it in an oven, if you bake it on a griddle, if you fry it in a pan, here's how you do it. Then there's some restrictions in verse 11. No grain offering that you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, so no yeast. For you shall burn no leaven, nor honey, which would be considered a natural yeast, as a food offering to the Lord. In verse 12, as an offering of first fruits, you can also bring them to the Lord. So I mentioned that there's 3 times people had to bring sacrifices. The offerings of first fruits would be when you brought your harvest in, and you set aside the first part of your harvest, in this case your grain, and then you would mill up that grain, and then you would take the first part of that flour, and you would dedicate that to the Lord. So imagine that you say, my first paycheck in January, I'm going to give the whole paycheck to the church, because it's my first paycheck of the year. Okay, that's an offering of first fruits, in a roundabout way. And you have to add salt. Verse 13, you shall season all your grain offerings with salt. And then again, first fruits in verse 14 is how you do the first fruits. And then a summary in verse 16. So that's the grain offering, which is making bread. So you've got meat being cooked, you've got bread being cooked. It would smell pretty good. And then peace offerings. And so peace offerings are also, they're similar to burnt offerings, but they're a little different. Chapter 3, if his offering of sacrifice is a peace offering, so there's our title. If he offers an animal from the herd, it can be male or female. So the peace offering can be a male or a female, of the cattle, of the goats. It doesn't say anything about birds in this case, at this time, for the peace offering. So it has to be a larger animal. And, I guess we left off there. So it can be a larger animal. And you'll notice that it's different from the burnt offering. So verse 2 of chapter 3, the person bringing it lays his hand on the head of his offering and kills it at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron's priests throw the blood against the sides of the altar. That's the same. And from the sacrifice of the peace offering, as a food offering, so burnt offering, he shall offer the fat. And then notice they cut off all the fat. So the fat covering the entrails, the fat that's in the cavity of the animal, the kidneys with the fat that is on them. Evidently, it's too hard to get the fat off, so you just burn the whole thing. The lobe of the liver, the fatty lobe, as it's sometimes called, of the liver, so that fat is removed as well. And all of that is burnt on the offering. And again, it's a pleasing aroma.